Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I'm returning to the subject of Rackmount NAS devices, and today I'm comparing these two NAS systems, very compact 1U NAS systems to that. This is the Synology RS422 Plus, and I'm comparing it against the QNAP TS-435XeU. Not a great catchy name, but we'll move forward. Neither one of them are really when you want to put pen to paper. But before we go any further, it's worth touching on something about rack mounts. Anyone that's ever been following this channel and the way I talk about a lot of server technology, you'll know that I definitely cover desktop devices a lot more than rack mount. Now, why is that? Well, nice and simple. For the longest of times, rack mounts lived in the business sector. They lived somewhere in a little server room, somewhere in a rack cabinet, but ultimately, business. Big, medium, small, it was all business. And it's only really been in about the last 2.5 years that we have seen rack mount deployment happening more and more in the home. Maybe it's because the hardware architecture that a rack mount provides is often comparatively higher than that of a desktop, thanks to larger space and different deployment methods. Maybe it's because the price of rack mounts has come down quite significantly in recent years, or simply just the sheer scale of them, and we're seeing more and more rack mounts arriving that are fantastically small. They may seem very wide, but because of that height and indeed the depth at 30 centimeters in most cases, the result is that these are actually surprisingly easy to deploy. Also, unlike a desktop system that needs to have ventilation on either side and often ventilation on the base, a rack mount system completely prioritizes horizontal cooling. That is the air being drawn through the system, which again means deploying it can be a lot easier, not just in a rack cabinet, but also deploying it on a shelf in a garage up real high. They're not the quietest, and rack mounts are always going to be noisier than a comparative desktop system. But nonetheless, in terms of cooling, compact nature, drops in recent prices, and hardware scalability, rack mounts are becoming more and more popular. So I'm going to try to cover rack mounts a little bit more here on the channel. Now, these two rack mounts from Synology and QNAP respectively, I've covered on the channel before. I've reviewed them both, and I would say reviewed them quite positively. I was impressed with both systems of what they were giving you. However, unlike a lot of my comparisons, when I compare two NASes that are very similar in their hardware architecture, these two are really different. Indeed, I think a lot of you have seen this title card and gone, why on earth is he comparing these two systems? They've got different CPUs, different ports and connections, different memory. They are very different when you really get down to the nitty-gritty. Why am I comparing them? Well, nice and simple. They cost about the same. They both knock around for about somewhere in the late 600s, between 700 to 800 nicker, including your tax in your local region and your currency. You'll find the price point hovering somewhere between about 599 and 799. Somewhere in that, it's about a 200 nicker spectrum. So between those two devices, there's actually a lot of kind of flexibility with people's budgets, and a lot of people that are trying to find a compact rack mount solution for their home or business have flocked to these two devices because that money that you're spending is really prioritized in different directions, and that same spend on this 4U rack mount solution actually gives you very different hardware results as a consequence of that. So we're going to break today's video in several sections. We're going to talk about price and value. We're going to talk about hardware. We're going to talk about ports and connections. We're going to talk about software, and hopefully by the end help you decide which one is best suited to your storage needs. So let's immediately tackle that subject of that price there. Now, I would say right now that in terms of flexible pricing, this is available for less money. Although both of them have got varying price points depending on where you shop around, with the average somewhere about a 650, 700 nicker mark, I would say this is the one you find more regularly better pricing between the two of them depending on your region. It's by no means clear cut or black and white. It is very much kind of varied, and you can get offers on the 422. But in terms of price and what you're paying, and you shop around at different retailers, certainly the TS-435XeU, which I'm just going to keep calling the QNAP, by the way, because that name is really tricksy there towards the end, right now is the better priced of the two. But it gets more than that, actually, because it's actually, in terms of value, insanely good value, and we will go into more detail when we talk about the hardware, but this system, certainly, when it comes to the price point, if that's really, really important to you, the QNAP is probably going to take an early lead for you there. But let's talk about the hardware and that value point there, because these two devices, they bring you something a little bit different to the party. Now, I would say conventionally, in terms of standard, what people consider great internal hardware and what they, what people expect for good file processing, the Synology probably takes the lead here. The Synology arrives with an embedded AMD processor, and that's an embedded Ryzen. It's the R1600, which is a dual-core processor there. It's an x86 64-bit processor there. So again, you're talking about kind of internal quality VMs there. You're talking about some decent processing power. That dual-core processor arrives with a 2.6 gigahertz CPU that can be burst up to 3.1 when it's needed. So that is a decent amount of hardware power inside that Synology there. Now, the QNAP, on the other hand, the QNAP goes a slightly different route. It arrives with an ARM processor, ARM, which is a much more power efficient processor overall. Now, that ARM processor there, that one is a quad-core processor. It's an ARM, I'm going to read it from my notes, I'm afraid, CN9131 or 9130, because it is the same product family. It's the Octeon TX2 series. It's a very high-end 64-bit ARM processor there, and it's a 4-core 2.2 gigahertz processor inside there. So, in a flat-out race, this one's got more power under the hood. However, this is still a quad-core processor. That's a 2-core, 4-thread processor, but this processor in quad-core still kind of has it beat in terms of multitask over the top. Now, moving forward from that, we can talk about the memory, because that's another huge area of difference between these two. And memory, anyone that's ever owned a Rackmount server for business, you'll know that as good as a CPU is, the memory is very important, because it allows you to run more simultaneous processes. It allows you to run more apps, and indeed still have a decent amount of memory for the base level system. And this is a really weird position that the RS422 Plus has, because it arrives with 2 gig, and that's it. It's got 2 gig of DDR4 ECC memory, so it's very good memory, but it's soldered to the board. You can't upgrade the memory, and 2 gigs your limit. And 2 gig for a rack mount server with that CPU is a real crying shame. That CPU inside this also arrives on that desktop DS1522 Plus, alongside arriving in future Synology installments as well. And that CPU, coupled with just 2 gig of memory, is a tremendous low glass ceiling for you there, which is a real shame. Now, the QNAP doesn't arrive with ECC memory. It arrives with DDR4 standard class memory, but it arrives with 4 gig by default, which can be upgraded to 32 gig, which again, yes, that CPU isn't going to win a race against the one inside the Synology, but you're getting still a decent ARM processor there, and a ridiculous amount of memory by comparison there, which is really important. Another thing to bear in mind with this system, and I've already removed some of the screws, but I will remove a couple more, is that the Synology system, is a 4U rack mount, a 1U 4-bay rack mount. It allows you to install 4 hard drives there inside. And although there is a range of compatible drives in there, they do kind of highly recommend using their own Synology hard drives there. You can use some drives from WD and Seagate and Toshiba and stuff like that, but the compatibility and support on their support pages isn't quite as clear-cut from Synology there, and there's kind of mention of some services and support not being quite as fully encompassing as if you use Synology's own drives on this system. Again, that does still lead to the idea that they would still have to pinpoint that any failure with the system or any difficulty with the system is down to those drives, but still nonetheless, with their own kind of presentation and marketing, they do seem to give a priority to their own storage media. Now, in the case of the QNAP, it is much wider in terms of its support and compatibility. They don't have their own branded drives there, so they kind of say you can use pretty much anything and larger capacities as well. But if we remove this lid, we can talk about another little sneaky feature that I do love, and that is that inside this, you've got these 2 M2 NVMe slots inside there. Those 2 M2 NVMe slots there allow you to install M2 NVMe SSDs from Seagate and WD, and they allow you to either use them as caching alongside the main base to bolster internal performance with read and write caching in a number of different ways. You can also use them for tiered storage, which allows you to combine hardware and software hard drive and SSD pools into one giant storage pool that is combined of larger but slower hard drives and smaller capacity but faster performing SSDs, and then the system will move more frequently accessed files, not copy like caching, but move frequently accessed files of a varied degree of scales to the faster storage area with QTIER, which can really benefit different file operations on this, particularly for video editors and large sequential data, something that is less beneficial in caching, which is far more about I/O and random 4K. So again, those two bays in there being used either for caching or for tiered storage, and let's not forget, as standalone storage pools shouldn't be overlooked, because it allows you to ultimately have a 6-bay system. It's the 4 main bays, but also gives you the option of adding those 2 SSD bays as raw storage, caching, or a combination of the two with that tiering. Now, that's something that's not available in the RS422 Plus. It is in the desktop, but 5-bay, that 1522 I mentioned earlier on, but that lack of those drives is a real crying shame there for a feature that is growing in popularity, and Synology themselves have embraced M2 NVMEs on a number of their systems over the years. So again, really surprised it's not in the Synology, and applaud QNAP for including it inside their system, particularly when you think about that ARM processor. Now, those slots are NVMe PCIe Gen 3x1, so they are limited to 1000 megs, but still, it's better to have a couple of potential 1000 meg slots than to not have them at all, right? Now, that brings us moving forward into ports and connections. We're not going to talk about design. Normally by now I talk about the design of these boxes, but frankly, they are 1-bay rack mounts. They are near enough bloody identical, so we're not going to talk about design. They are half-depth rack mounts. They're 30 centimetres, which is always good, but again, they've both got that quality, so we're not really going to give a tick or a cross on either one of them. But in terms of ports and connections, that's another bit of really surprising news between these two, because we've seen innovations from both of these brands when it comes to network connectivity, which is the bread and butter of network attached storage, those ports and connections, and particularly in a time now when internet connections domestically can be purchased quite moderately reasonably to exceed that of gigabit internet, means you can potentially have access to a cloud out there of a higher speed than 1 GBE. So 1 GBE right now is becoming very passé. It's becoming very not so sure about that. And people can either upgrade to 10 GBE or take advantage of things like 2.5 GBE and 5 GBE, which, although aren't as popular, obviously, as 1 GBE, or the more expensive but still becoming more affordable 10G, are still arriving at the same price as 1G in many, many cases. And 2.5 GBE is getting popular. It's arriving on ISP routers, it's arriving on a lot of different network peripherals out there, and given it's arriving at the same price as 1 GBE, it should be arriving everywhere, to be frank. But with these two, let's talk about, the average strengths of both of them. So if we start with the Synology, what we have is we have a USB port which can be used for a UPS or for some storage variables and different activities, but frankly, Synology in DSM 7.1 and DSM 7 in of itself has really stripped a lot of the features and services from USB on their systems, and the result is that the USB ports on these are becoming less and less useful. It is a USB 3.2 Gen 1 port, so 5 gigabits per second, but we're not really going to penalise it too much in this comparison. Alongside it, we have a couple of 1 GBE ports, which is thoroughly underwhelming. However, it also has this. You have the option to add a 10 gigabit Ethernet port to this. Currently only in copper, but I'm sure Synology will work out a fibre version in due course. And that adapter, which knocks around for about 120, 130 nicker, arriving on a PCIe Gen 3x2 micro module adapter, is slotted in there really easily. No need to dismantle the whole thing, and you could add 10 gigabit Ethernet to this system, which is going to be very beneficial for this series. Now, Synology have included PCIe upgrade slots on their rack mounts before, but this is the first time this tier has seen that upgrade become available, so that's really, really nice. I wish it had 10 GBE by default, or at least 2.5 GBE, but it's still nice to have that upgrade option down the line for just another, again, 120, 130 nicker. But remember, this QNAP arrived at basically, give or take, a couple of tenors, the same sort of price. And I've got to say, QNAP have absolutely smashed it in terms of network connectivity on this box. Let's get the dull stuff out of the way. We've got USB ports. There's two USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, so 5 gigabits per second, and a couple of USB 2 ports on there, which are an utter waste of time in my opinion. Would have been great if it had been an HDMI and create a KVM, but I don't care about those USB. They could be used for printers, be used for UPSs, basically low bandwidth connected peripherals, but again, I'm going to prioritise those USBs more than anything. But where things get really interesting are these two ports and these two ports. These two are 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. So you've got a couple of Ethernet ports, sorry, those are the 2.5 GBE, couldn't tell, the light is in my eyes. These two are the 2.5 GBE copper ports. That means both of those can give you between, or each, 250 to about 270 megabytes per second, and you can lag them together for 5 gigabit Ethernet via port trunking or link aggregation, which means both of those will give you something in the region of 540 to maybe 560 or even 570 megabytes per second external throughput with a supported switch. And remember, it's backwards compatible, they can be used with one, but it's the idea that they support up to 2.5, which is really impressive. But even more so than that, this 700 nicker box, give or take, has got two 10 GBE ports. Now, let's look at this objectively. One, there is no way you can populate this device with just 4 drives and fully saturate both of those. It's a 4-bay, it's impossible. I mean, even with the fastest, say you maxed each of those SATA ports to 6 GBE, even in the RAID and with that CPU, you're not going to be able to hit it. Indeed, if you go to QNAP's own site, they say with fully populated SSDs inside, they were able to saturate the 2 GBE. They could saturate both of these 10 GBE ports in read with the right sequential setup. In terms of write, it was just above 900 megs, give or take there. So no one is going to be thinking you can fully saturate these in a standard utilization with lag. But it's the idea you've got them there. You can have two individual 10 GBE networks connected to this or lag them. On top of that, you can get hold of between 130 and 160 nicker. I think some of them go up to, depending on the quality, up to 200 quid. You can get adapters that change SFP to copper, and then change one or both of these to a copper 10 GBE. You could have one internal copper 10 GBE network there going into a supported switch or environment, and another one going into a long distance fiber setup there for 10 GBE. Now that's not an optional upgrade, that's included, which is really hard to overlook just how impressive at this price point that is. Now again, we can't overlook that CPU is going to be working ridiculously hard, and it is an ARM processor, so graphical processes are going to take something of a kicking, but there's still no avoiding what a fantastic range of ports and connections this is. It doesn't have the option, of course, of taking advantage of a PCIe upgrade. For example, you can't upgrade with another 10 GBE port, or maybe even a fiber 25 GBE, which again, 4-bay, what's wrong with you? But at the same time, you've got the M2 bays inside. You've got two 10 GBE ports by default. I'm not sure what PCIe card you're going to put in there. And then you can talk about expandability. I've not really touched on this. I should have mentioned it earlier. But this RS422 Plus can't be expanded. You can't use any of the Synology expansions, the RX series. I believe it's the RX 418. It may have seen a refresh. But you can't expand beyond those 4 bays. This allows 2 expansions to be connected via those USB 3 ports. So you can attach 2 12-bay expansions. And it's the TLR1200C if you choose. So you can attach USB expansions in rack mount form to add another 24 bays of storage. And then those little 10 GBEs will have something to talk about. But again, you cannot, it's unquestionable in terms of ports and connectivity that the QNAP wins this round by an absolute country mile. And finally, let's talk software. And to be frank, as much as QNAP have done with QTS and how much it's improved in terms of its features, in terms of what you can do with it, DSM still largely rules the roost between these two. Now, again, QTS is very, very good, I think. I think it's got a lot of featured applications, a lot of experimental apps on there, sometimes a little bit too experimental for its own good. And it has made changes to its architecture in terms of its security, in terms of its usability and its GUI. But not only does DSM still kind of appear as the more fluid, the more user-friendly, and just the more accessible application for novice users, but at the same time, both of these arriving with their own software included, that CPU is going to run the software better for the Synology than that ARM is going to run QTS. Now, QNAP have worked on a lot of their applications to make them more efficient. Great example would be QVR. Their surveillance platform, they released QVR Elite, which is far more efficient in terms of its hardware utilization for the apps and services. And they've been tweaking and improving a number of their apps to run better on ARM. But still, between these two and the software capabilities, if you're a new user or a business user that doesn't want to deal with too much of an uphill learning curve, DSM is still going to be the better win for you there. It runs beautifully well, and once again, because of the CPU architecture that both of these NASs have gone for, DSM is going to run better thanks to that application. We can't overlook that tremendously limiting 2 gig of memory, but still, unless you're going to be pushing the device significantly or running a lot of more aggressive apps, and definitely if you are choosing to run more graphical-led apps, even though neither one of them have embedded graphics, the Synology is just going to do a better job of those overall, whether it's using their own first-party services or third-party services. So again, that's where a lot of that money is going with this system. It's going into that CPU architecture, and it's going into DSM. It always has done. Whereas the QNAP, it's a much broader spread of your money in terms of the software and the hardware, and ultimately in terms of what you're getting for your money. And between these two, I would say if you are buying one of these as a combined hardware-software solution and you intend to rely on the first-party software, go for the Synology. However, if you're integrating the Rackmount NAS system into an already existing hardware environment, or you're integrating the system towards other systems too, and you need them to communicate, and you need to have a little bit of flexibility and customization, the QNAP TS-435 is going to have your back. It's tremendously flexible by comparison, has those memory upgrades, has a phenomenal range of ports and connections and expandability, and those M2s inside. And in terms of hardware, and at that price point, it is borderline unbeatable. Just bear in mind, that processor comes a little bit of a glass ceiling there overall. This has been my comparison of the RS422 and the TS-435XeU. Seriously, I hate that name. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. I will be covering Rackmounts more and more, as I see this is a growing subject that I used to kind of go, well, it's business don't watch YouTube. But now, of course, a lot of you home users are jumping on the Rackmount bandwagon, and I want to keep you guys in the loop. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Visit the links in the description to the respective individual reviews for these boxes, and I will see you next time.